Welcome to today's stream. My name is Ariana. I am the co-director of the Consent Academy, and I hope that you're all having a lovely day. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, I hope it's nice. Welcome. If you don't know the Consent Academy, we are an international but Seattle-based nonprofit that aims to promote consent as part of everyday life. And we stream Tuesdays and Sundays. Welcome. Check out our other stuff. Oh yeah, thank you for the subscription, Aradin. Much appreciated, much appreciated. Yes, and if you like what we do, if you like what you do, if you like what we do, uh, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/consentacademy. Or check out our upcoming classes on our website. We have a lot in November and early December. You should check it out. A couple that we have coming up. Today, starting in an hour, we have our trans, non-binary, and genderqueer consent support group. Next week, on Saturday, we have trauma-informed practices for leadership. If you want to learn a little bit more about how to respond to someone else's trauma or trauma response, how to identify trauma responses, learn a little bit more about how it functions, a little bit more about how to interact with somebody when they're having a trauma response, and how you can create a better environment if you're in any form of leadership, official, unofficial, formal, non-formal. The video keeps freezing. That's weird. Okay, let me exit out of some of my tabs. I do have like 400 tabs open. Maybe that's why. I don't have my VPN on, so I would actually be really surprised if it were that. Let me just bring up my task manager and see if there's anything funky happening. Nope. Nope. No. I have a lot of RAM. Well, anyway, hopefully it gets better. It might be my fault for not doing the most recent update for Stream Elements. I didn't have time today. Or last time. I will get on that after today's stream. I'm glad you can hear me, Aradin, and hear me fine. Thank you also. I really appreciate you letting me know. Where was I? Oh, yes. My video seems to keep freezing. That's really strange. It's really strange. Yeah, if it continues to persist, let me know. I might try a few things. Uh, Also, yes. Okay. Okay. I'm sleepy today. Busy weekend. Next, after that, we have on the 19th of November, Saturday, we've got a class on how harm creates responsibilities. That when something goes wrong, it's not so much about who is responsible, but the idea that harm creates responsibilities and that different people in different positions in any situation where harm has happened are going to have different responsibilities. And it's a very fun class. I really, really like it. I really like discussing sort of like both the sort of philosophy around harm and accountability and responses to it, but also giving like really practical, like what do you actually do? Like it's one thing to have a ton of philosophy, but it doesn't necessarily give you like an actual game plan. And so a lot of our Consent Academy classes intend to do both, to give you like some background ideas and then also give you like concrete skills that you can go and use. So check it out. And then what else do we have coming up? Oh yeah. On the 27th, hello, Sar. On the 27th, I'm gonna do a special stream about Thanksgiving and the history of Thanksgiving and why it's both a lovely and fun modern holiday with a dark, dark past. It is not intended to shame people for celebrating Thanksgiving. Uh, Thanksgiving food's delicious. I love Thanksgiving sandwiches, stuffing, cranberry sauce, all of that, delicious. I love oh, thank you, Aradan. That's so kind. Um, I love, yeah, just food and getting together with people to make delicious food. And I think it's great, but I want to have the opportunity to talk about it. And I think it gives people more informed consent in participating in holidays. Some of what we're going to talk about this month on our Sunday streams is going to be related to interacting with your family related to the holidays. Holiday season has started. And even if you don't celebrate any particular holiday, people do tend to spend sort of more time in close quarters with people that they live with, that they're related to, that they're close friends with. And it can be a stressful thing, right? It can be kind of stressful to, uh, yeah, just be in that much more proximity to other people. And it can put you in close proximity with people you don't necessarily spend a ton of time with. And it can be really stressful. It can be really stressful to figure out, like, how do I navigate these things, especially if I don't want to lose the relationship. Um, oh yeah, that's going on a tangent. Yes. I didn't realize that was only for people who are subscribed. Shows what I know about Twitch. Anyway, yeah, we're going to talk a lot about that this month and some next month. Some skills for setting some boundaries with family, how to deal with maybe family members who are having very strong opinions about things that are maybe being shared for the intent of getting a rise out of people or basically just not very like in good faith. How do you respond to that? And if you want to change somebody's mind, how do you go about doing that? Or how do you go about trying to consensually help someone change their mind about something that might be harmful? So we're going to talk about that a bunch coming up this month. But today, I thought it'd be really fun to do some more of these Reddit relationship advice. Thank you for the toast emojis, Zar. I made that. uh, I'm not very good at making the emojis, and I love toast, so I was like, yeah, let's add some toast. Um, yeah, I thought it would be fun to, yeah, just go through some more of these Reddit relationship advice questions and a few of the "Am I the assholes?" and talk about a little bit of that question I titled today's stream as is like, "Am I the asshole?" And how do I know if I'm being the asshole? Like, it can actually be. We can all get into situations where we might look back later and be like, was it appropriate? Uh, uh, I think that, yeah, was it appropriate what I did or said? How do I know about the impact I'm having on other people? Especially, we can't just like peer into the minds of others, and people can give us conflicting information or they can react in a way that we feel negatively about and think that, oh man, this person is obviously being ridiculous. How do we kind of figure it out? Yeah, toast is amazing, Rod. It's really good. Uh, okay, so let's start with this one. It's actually a relationship advice question, but it could easily be an "Am I the asshole?" post. Um, so the title is "Neighbor Across the Street Uses Car Alarm as an Actual Alarm." For a long time now, around the same time, my neighbor's car alarm goes off the same time Monday through Friday. I was talking to the neighbor directly next to them as they are across the street from me and said that it has to be on purpose. My next door neighbor has been there for over 50 years and knows the neighborhood pretty well. And she told me that the car alarm is a literal alarm clock, literal alarm like an alarm clock. I'm sure it's I'm sure, okay, sorry, this is a little grammatically incorrect, so I gotta figure out what they're trying to say. I'm not sure how or why they are doing this, but it's pretty disruptive. My wife works from home and I sometimes have to make calls, and it is quite annoying when the car alarm goes off in the middle of those things. It also causes some of the dogs to howl and bark. I'm asking you guys on how I should handle it. I was thinking of going over there and seeing if everything is okay when it goes off, if I'm around, and maybe buying them an alarm clock. Thank you in advance. Okay. It's one of those things where I understand having a hard time waking up. I do. I will sleep through alarms pretty regularly. I will even turn my alarm off and not have any memory. And like I will dream that I get up and go and do things, and then I don't. Um, but I've had to figure out other strategies for helping me wake up to actually make sure I get up. And there's some very creative tools that you can use. For a lot of people who are deaf or hard of hearing, there's also tools you can get that will shake or vibrate your bed as a way to wake you up. Like there are alternatives if the normal alarm does not get you out of bed. You know, uh, every once in a while, I'm like, the best thing that would get me out of bed in the morning would be like my bed to literally just dump me out and like music to start blaring and everything. But I wouldn't want to disrupt Charlie or my neighbors. And this is tough. Like the question here is much more like, how do I approach this? So I want to think about like how we can approach this without necessarily escalating the situation. Um, we don't want it to become like a war with our neighbor, especially because if that happens, people might be more likely to double down on their behavior. Um, Meaning that they become like more committed to it because not everybody likes being called out or being told that they're wrong. There are lots of good examples of this. And yeah, so what do you think? If you're in chat, what do you think so far? How would you talk to your neighbor about this? If you were pretty sure that they're using their car alarm as an actual alarm and it's disruptive to you, how would you approach it? What do we think? You're right around, and their idea seems like a good starting point. Going over there and asking if everything's okay. Um, Especially if it creates this sort of like association. Like if the neighbor knows that every time their alarm goes off that you're going to come over and be like, is everything all right? Um, that might be something, but that could become something that seems in certain ways, if it's done in certain ways, it could become very passive aggressive. And one of the issues here is that purely sort of setting a boundary isn't necessarily going to be the thing that works, because a boundary usually is like, here is what I would like you to do or not to do, usually not do, or stop doing, or only do up until this point. And if you don't respect that, I'm going to like take myself out of this situation. Like, if you say to somebody, I only have 30 minutes to talk, that's not the same as saying, I only have 30 minutes to talk and I'm going to end this call at 30 minutes. You know, telling someone like, I need you to respect my time more is not really communicating well. And you can't necessarily remove yourself from this situation, right? And you don't want to harass them. So what do you think? What could we do? It does seem to be that the alarm is not going off incredibly early in the morning. Seems a little bit later in the day. Arad, and you say, I was only thinking of doing it once, but yeah, doing it every time is passive aggressive, but kind of funny too. Yeah, I mean, like, there's, I don't want to say this. It's not possible to be like perfectly unproblematic and perfectly consensual all the time. And there's also needs to be room for sort of like humor and human interactions. And that humor can take on the aspect of being slightly annoying to each other every once in a while, within reason and genuinely respecting it if people really say that they need you to stop. But I think that there is some truth to the idea of like kind of creating this response every time. Could be funny. It might be effective, but is not necessarily the most consensual. Especially because they probably would just stop answering the door if you were really bothering them. So this is where I want to introduce a skill that is actually a really useful skill for interacting with anybody. So I think I've talked about this before. In sort of like communication theory and interpersonal sort of effectiveness, there's the idea that in any sort of interpersonal situation, there are usually about 3 potential goals: getting what you want, maintaining the relationship, and maintaining self-respect. And hello, Whistler. That these 3 goals are usually in harmony with each other. There's no conflict between those 3 goals. It's really fine for you to, you don't feel like there's any tension between them. But sometimes there's not always a way to get all 3 at the same time. Sometimes you have to sacrifice some self-respect to get what you want. That's a lot of people with their jobs. They want money, they need money to survive, and they feel that their job is not always the most respectful, so they sacrifice some self-respect, or they sacrifice some of their sort of boundaries or how they would like to do things in order to get what they want, which is to be paid and to have money. So then in this case, it's not necessarily that anything is in conflict here, because it doesn't actually seem like this person actually has a relationship with their neighbor other than the relationship of proximity currently. But there are 2 other goals. This person wants to maintain their self-respect, which is that they want their boundaries to be respected, and they probably don't want to act in a way that is going to make them feel bad about how they conducted themselves later. We can assume that's kind of true for most people. But then the other thing is that they have a thing that they want. They want their neighbor to stop doing this thing. And so the first skill or the first tool I would just say in this situation is don't go into a situation assuming you know why someone is doing something or assuming their intent with something. Generally, when we're frustrated by what someone is doing, we can be a little bit less forgiving and be a little bit more judgmental. And so we might go in assuming, oh, you're doing X, Y, and Z because A, B, and C. And A, B, and C is usually not like a great thing. We can have a tendency to do a bit of mind reading. Remember, in past episodes, we've talked a little bit about some cognitive distortions and sort of how they can creep up and sort of the effect that they can have. And so we would want to start by listening and actually listening for understanding. We would want to go and ask our neighbor, hey, what's the deal with the car alarm? And, genuinely want an answer, right? We can't just go there and be like, okay, I'm waiting until you finish so I can tell you to stop doing it. Because if the person doesn't feel respected in that first moment, in that situation, they're not necessarily going to care than what you have to say. So you would want to start with saying, okay, hey, like I've noticed Monday through Friday at the same time every day, your car alarm goes off. I'm just wondering if you can tell me what's going on with that. You don't need to put in any other information at that time. You can just sort of ask for more information, sort of without saying, hey, it's really disruptive to me, or like, why are you doing this? You don't want to start with that. And then once you've actually sort of understood what's going on, we can do this other skill. I think I've talked about it on the chat before, let me just bring it up. I think I've talked about it on stream before, but the first one I want to give you, it's from this concept in clinical psychology called interpersonal effectiveness, and sort of applied psychology. This is sort of the staple of nonviolent communication. And I want to just look at what is Dear Man. Let me see. This will probably be fine. Yeah, here we go. So Dear Man is the sort of objective effectiveness skill. It's when you have something you want and you would like to get it. You want to increase the likelihood that people are going to give you what you want, what you're asking for. It doesn't guarantee that they will, but it increases the likelihood that they will. And it also decreases the risk of people becoming really defensive. It is different than deer man, as in a deer as the animal. But here, it's a skill set you can use because you want to communicate facts about a situation non-judgmentally. This is one of the biggest skills. If we come into this neighbor and just say, hey, asshole, what the fuck is wrong with you? Why are you using your car alarm as your alarm? You're so selfish. Yeah, that's probably not going to go well. It's more likely that the person is going to feel defensive, they're going to feel attacked, they're going to feel misunderstood, and probably double down on the behavior. Whereas if instead we come in and say, like, hey, I'm really curious, what's the situation here? And get more information, and then we could maybe kind of go in and say, okay, yeah, like, thank you for explaining this to me. Makes sense how this would be helpful for you. I can see why, like, the normal alarm isn't enough because it's too easy for you to turn it off, and like having to get up and turn your car alarm off is really better for you in this way. Like, I get it. I get it. And I think that that's really, the person is going to be more likely then to listen. It's no guarantee, but how you would start it is you kind of follow this step. So you describe the situation, meaning you describe it non-judgmentally and without emotion. You just say, here's the situation. For example, you did not call yesterday. Can we talk about it? So you could say, okay, I understand that you use your car alarm as your regular alarm because it's the only thing that gets you up well enough for work. Can we talk about this? And then you would definitely want to wait for them to actually give you a yes, because when people say yes to something, they are more likely to be comfortable with what you actually say after that. Like if you say, can I give you some advice? And someone says yes, they're more likely to accept the advice. But you have to want a genuine answer from them. And then the next thing is you express the effect that the situation is having on you. You could say something like, I feel sad when you don't call. And you, as it says here, you really want to stick to what's called I statements. If I come in and say, I feel sad when you don't call, that's less likely to make you feel defensive than if I say, you make me sad when you don't call. Because anytime we get into a you statement, it tends to make people feel judged, which tends to make us more afraid of what's happening and tends to make us more defensive. So if we come in and we just say like, hey, thank you so much for explaining to me the situation with your car alarm. I get it. And I understand, you need to use your car alarm because it's the only thing that wakes you up in the morning. And can we talk a little bit more about it? I feel really stressed out when your car alarm goes off because I'm often in work meetings at that time. And it's rough that it's happening every day. And then you would want to express impact as well. You can say like what the effect it's having on you and like it's difficult for my job. And then you would want to assert or ask. As much as possible, you want this to be a single sentence. You'd want it to be as clear of a statement as possible. And you really want it to be as much about like one sentence, one very clear ask. So what this means is as much as possible before you get into a situation where you're doing this skill, you want to know what is it exactly I want to ask this person for. I don't want to ask them to be more considerate because that's not actually an ask. That doesn't actually give this person any idea of how to move forward. I don't want to ask the person to like, immediately change their entire life for me, but I might want to ask them for something else. I could say, can we strategize together about maybe a different way to get you out of bed that isn't so disruptive, such as, can we create a plan together? Could we get a different type of alarm clock, like the kind that shakes your bed? Maybe they've tried it before and they're going to say no, but we'll come to that. The other thing you want to do is reinforce. point out the benefits of granting your request. What does the other person get out of it? This might seem a little bit forced, but sometimes what they get out of it is then this won't become a problem, or it will protect our relationship, or, I'll be really happy with you if there isn't a really clear benefit for them. But sometimes the reinforce can also be like, then there won't be other problems. Like, if this persists, like I don't want to have to involve the legal system, but I really can't have this behavior. You wouldn't want to come in necessarily like that, but this is what you're thinking. So you could say something instead of saying like, hey, I don't want to have to call the legal system, because that's likely also to freak people out. You could say something like, and then, this won't become a bigger issue. We can just kind of figure it out together. We'll create a different plan, and then the problem will stop there. And for a lot of people, the idea of a problem not becoming a bigger problem can be pretty attractive. The other things is to be mindful or maintain focus. So here, this is a tool that this particular M has changed a little bit over the years and exactly how it's written, but I want to talk about what it also used to say. First, we'll say mindful means pay attention to your own and the other person's posture, tone of voice, facial expression, level of discomfort, and try to keep yourself as respectful and calm as possible. That used to be more included in the appear confident aspect, but mindful also used to mean maintain focus. And what that meant here is if the person you're talking to starts to try to bring up other situations, this is very common. You want to talk to somebody about something they're doing that hurts your feelings or that you don't like or is a problem. And they're like, hey, well, 10 years ago, you did this, that, and the other. It's one of those things, like my dad used to do this all to me all the time, even through until, maybe 5 years ago. I would want to talk about something that had happened that I was not super happy with. And he would want to bring up how he's still unhappy about how much money I spent on video games as a teenager. It's very, very, very common because the stressful feeling that the person has coming up related to this conversation also brings other memories to do with you or the situation surrounding what you're talking about up as well. And so it's not necessarily this like intentional diversion tactic. It's more this sort of like emotional experience that tends to make people less effective and get more distracted. And what you can say in those cases is, thank you for bringing this up. This is a very important conversation. I want to give that conversation the time it deserves. And right now we're talking about this thing. And you can be a broken record about it. Really just bring them back to the conversation at hand. It can be easy to lose track of it, especially if people are really, like if the tension gets higher, if people say things that also produce emotional effects on you. That's really common. And if you use this skill, and you go into a situation kind of prepared for what you're going to talk about, it tends to be easier. You want to appear confident. This is really important because sometimes when we're asking for things, if we seem unsure of what it is we're asking for, it's more likely that the person is not going to feel good about what we're asking for either. They're going to be like, okay, if you're not even confident in this thing, you want a raise from me or you want more days off, and you're trying to tell me that it's going to like make you more productive, but you seem super unsure. Even subconsciously, people are going to be less likely to agree with it and engage with it. So what you can do is just try to keep your breathing steady. Be careful of what you're doing with your hands. Don't necessarily like move them all over the place or like, constantly kind of do fidget with them. If you have trouble with it, I recommend just adopting certain hand poses. Angela Merkel has a great one where she always held her hands like this to seem really calm, but also kept her from fidgeting with her hands. But there's a lot of things you can do to keep your hands calm. Take deep breaths, let it come out even during the situation, because if you take deep breaths, it's also more likely that the other person's going to take deep breaths too. Welcome back, Aradin. And that's going to make them feel calmer as well, because they'll tend to mirror you. And you want to, as it says here, avoid crossing your arms because this kind of communicates defensiveness and being, sort of less open, even if you're doing it because you're cold. If it's cold out, just make sure you're like wearing enough clothes to be warm before you get into this kind of situation with somebody. And then, just allow them to express themselves. It says here nodding affirmatively when others are describing, expressing, or asserting their concerns, and adopting a willing posture. So you don't want to shut them down if they sort of start to explain again, like, hey, I get that it's so disruptive, but it's only a few seconds every day. And like, it's the only thing that has worked for me. I've tried all these other things you've said. You don't want to just be like, hey, listen, I don't care. I mean, you can, but that's going to be more of an asshole kind of response to things. But what you want to do is just say, okay. And then the last step is negotiate. This is genuinely the last step because it's very, very common for people who feel uncomfortable with, shy, embarrassed about the thing they're asking for to ask and then immediately negotiate down from their actual ask before the other person has even had the chance to say no. Where it's like, hey, I would love it if we could actually spend more time together during dinner and like not just be on our phones, but like only if you don't have an important work thing to answer, or like, if the conversation isn't too boring, whatever, like people will really just immediately launch into negotiating out of the thing that they're asking for. And it's why it's really important to have that be the last step, because you don't want to negotiate until the person has said no. So this is going to be one of the skills you can use. Yes, it is absolutely true. It's not, you're not likely to get what you want, right? It depends on the situation. Sometimes asking is all it takes, and then the person realizes, oh yeah, like you're right, I've been inconsiderate in this way, or like I should have been doing this thing, or there is this great benefit to the thing you're asking me to do, and it's good. And other times it's not, and it really depends on the person and the situation. But this increases the likelihood of getting what you want, decreases the likelihood of the situation really escalating, the other person getting defensive, and for either of you acting like the asshole. So this can be very, very helpful. Okay, so that's how I would approach this neighbor. That's exactly what I would do. I will probably write that to this person because I have put this kind of response on a lot of relationship advice stuff, which is basically, dear man, dear man, dear man. It's like the thing that will get you the best shot at getting what you want in a situation. Um, and yeah, and it's also true, Auden, when people ask what type of salary you're looking for in an interview, I hate these questions. It needs to just become standard for salary ranges to be listed in the job posting and for people to just know what they're getting into when they come in and be able to ask, like, what are the things that differentiate people in the salary range from low to high earners? Like, what's the difference here? And getting a really clear understanding and like actually having, this is more like stuff I want to take up with HR in a lot of companies, and just say, like, you need to have an actual policy and procedure for the things that affect, if you have a salary range for a job, especially for a new hire, what are the things that are going to affect that, so that you can make sure that your responses to new hires are consistent and proportional. Because it's just the only way to not make it just an absolute clusterfuck of discrimination and bias and other problems. But I could talk about how HR could be a lot better. I could spend hours talking about how HR needs some help. Yep, and you're absolutely right, Rodden. A lot of the time they can use it to get you to negotiate against yourself. Yeah, and my response a lot of the time, I've asked these questions, or been asked these questions in uh, interviews, and my response is basically what I just said, which is like, what is your metric for evaluating these sorts of things? Oh, you don't have one? Oh, it's like case by case basis. Here's why that's kind of ridiculous, and here's how like you could do it better. Sometimes I've gotten the job offer, sometimes I haven't. I don't necessarily think that it was because of that. And I try not to be an asshole when I'm telling people those things. Um, yeah. All right, so let's look at the next one. This one is kind of long. And I don't necessarily want to read it in all the detail. I just kind of want to read a little bit of it right now and think about the sort of line between what we might owe to other people and to family and to commitments we have made, and also like our own boundaries and our own well-being. Because there are going to be times in life where the right thing to do is to honor commitments we've made even when we don't necessarily want to. It's not always the most consensual thing because it's not kind of happening with feeling. Or we could also argue that like the values or ethics that we may carry might compel us to want to honor the things we've promised to do, even when it is hard. But like figuring out when where we draw that line is really difficult. There are many things that I have promised to do for people, and then the situation became way different than what I was expecting. And like that I couldn't even have imagined, and I needed to back away from it. And there are other times where it was not great, but like the commitment I made was really important. All right. Also, let me know, is my camera still kind of desynced from my voice? I would love to know if it's getting better. All right, so here, am I the asshole for no longer wanting to be a caregiver for my pregnant daughter-in-law because of my son? So this is one of those things that's already in the title, got a lot of interesting things. So you're the caregiver for your pregnant daughter-in-law. So it's not your child. It's still stuttering. That's so strange. Um, it is a little better though. Yeah, I wonder. I wonder. We'll see. I'll have to look at it after. But thank you, Rodden, for letting me know. Okay. So, even if, for example, a relationship between your child and your child's spouse doesn't work out in the long term, if they have a child together, chances are you're going to have some kind of relationship with that person for a very long time. And there is a different sort of methodology to sort of how we should approach relationships and interact with people when there is a sense of interconnectedness and permanence there. It's one of the big things I talk about with Tuesday streams and the idea of like community consent, where it's like when we actually are interdependent on each other in a way that we can feel and acknowledge, we tend to act differently. And I've also mentioned before, I think, the guy who wrote the five love languages. A lot of people know the concept, haven't actually read the book. A lot of people will also say they read the book, and I'm like, you definitely didn't read the book. But one of the things is that he has another book. He's incredibly religious, a very conservative Christian, but one of the best books I've ever read on relationship advice. And it's problematic. Like, do not get me wrong. It's very heteronormative, very sexist. There's plenty of things about the book that are not great, but there's some stuff in there that I think is really important. There's a book called Covenant Marriage. And covenant marriage is like a type of legal and religious marriage where basically you're incapable of getting a divorce. And there are some states that allow you to get this kind of marriage. And he wrote this book being like, okay, you're in a covenant marriage. You basically have to be together forever. And setting aside really abusive relationships or where something sort of extreme is happening, and you really are having difficulty with each other, or you're not connecting anymore, or there's something going on, how do you make it not miserable? How do you get through the next, 40 plus years of your life together without, just being miserable the whole time? And it's got a lot of good advice there of like some steps you should really take to be careful with things like the regard you have for each other. How do you think about each other? What do you tell yourself about each other? You know, if you're constantly saying, like, how could I possibly deal with somebody who's like this? How could I possibly be in a relationship with someone who does these kinds of things? Versus saying, okay, my partner did this thing and it makes me really uncomfortable and I need to talk to them about it, or we need to change something in our dynamic. It's going to produce very different results. I'm not going to say I like a wholesale recommend this book, but I found it to be an incredibly helpful book for me. And I'm not Christian. And I'm not in that kind of marriage or anything. But I still was like, okay, there's a lot of really interesting thoughts here. Okay, setting it aside, let's go ahead and read this a bit. So, I'm in a really conflicting situation that requires unbiased judgment because I feel extremely guilty about the way I'm handling things. So, this is one of those things that's tough. If you're already feeling guilty about the way you're handling things, to me, this doesn't necessarily mean what you're doing is wrong. It can. Guilt is like, guilt and shame are these emotions that get these really bad raps, but I think that they have a lot of really important social functions. And so one of the things that can be really helpful is feeling guilty often is an indication of something within your value system or that you find important is not something you're able to kind of live up to or live with. And it's the same with, like, if I start to fixate on something and feel really anxious about something or feel like I'm messing something up, that just tells me that this thing is important to me. Okay, long story short, my daughter-in-law has severe morning sickness known as hyperemesis gravidarum, HG, and I'm tasked with her caregiving. It is a horrible sickness to have, and I feel extremely hurt for my daughter-in-law. When daughter-in-law was 3 months along, my son asked if me and my husband could take her in and care for her because he felt disrupted at work and couldn't sleep well. So this is tough. You know, pregnancy is no joke. It's like really a lot on a person's body. Some pregnancies are really lovely and like the person is just like glowing the whole time. And then like the baby just like leisurely walks out of the person and everything's fine and dandy. And for other people, it's like this really rough experience on the body. It's important to know what actually affects evolution. I'm just gonna do a little tangent here, mini tangent, mini tangent. Someone recently said to me, we were talking about like this report that said, oh, we all consume about like a credit card's worth of plastic a week, and my person I was talking to was like, oh, well, it doesn't matter, we'll just evolve to become the kind of people who can digest plastic. No, the things that tend to affect evolutionary changes are things that affect us before we are able to produce offspring. Because survival of the fittest has nothing to do with survival of the most fit, the strongest, the fastest, whatever. It has to do with the species that can produce the most offspring that themselves live long enough to produce offspring and over and over and over again. So the things that will tend to influence genetics and everything are things where did it prevent you from getting pregnant or having a child, and did it prevent that child from living long enough into adulthood to have their own children? And so a lot of things with pregnancy are not great because it does not need to be great. There's no real evolutionary pressure there because you get pregnant and like you can't necessarily always do something about that, 40,000 years ago and stuff. Maybe they knew, but maybe they didn't. But the pregnancy can be really rough on people because there's no evolutionary pressure that made it not rough on people. There was evolutionary pressure for things like hip width, because if the baby is getting stuck inside of the person trying to give birth and they both die in labor, then, really narrow hips, or not even just narrow hips, but there's like the bone structure in the pelvis that has to separate a little bit. And it can be like shaped like this. It can be shaped like this. It can have like all kinds of shapes. And ones that were not shaped well, that were very conducive to having a baby, tended to kill both people during labor and delivery. So there was a strong evolutionary pressure now. We've kind of undone that because Thankfully, we have the ability to have C-sections, so there's no longer that evolutionary pressure, and pelvises seem to be getting smaller on average. Okay. Anyway, just setting it all aside, I want to just explain that pregnancy, labor, post-pregnancy complications, menstruation, all of that, it did not need to be better for the person experiencing it because it's not really something that affected evolutionary pressure. Yeah, blame Eve. Yeah, there's lots of blame we could put on it. Mostly I blame nature. I blame the universe. I blame, yeah. Okay, so continuing. I immediately obliged and was happy to help because daughter-in-law's parents are overseas. Unfortunately, my daughter-in-law has mild paranoia that has stemmed from her, and I don't know what HG means here. If anyone can tell me, let me know. And thus sometimes feels unsafe and unfamiliar in our house and often shouts to see my son or gets really angry at times. I don't fault her for any of these things because I know she can't help it. There was a really good tweet that went around recently that was basically like, it doesn't make any sense when people say like depression and anxiety are A, B, and C, and mental illness is like this, but it's not like this, and then proceeds to describe symptoms of things like mania and psychosis. Because there are mental health, or people will say like, oh, I have so much compassion for people's mental health issues until they start to impact other people. Genuinely, there are many times where it can't be helped. Oh yes, thank you. Thank you, Aradin. Didn't really put that together. I kept thinking he was like homegrown. I was like, I don't know what that means. Okay. I accompanied my daughter-in-law to her appointments and stay by her side throughout when she is having severe nausea. I also sleep beside her for the night because I'm worried sick if she'd feel dizzy and fall while getting up in the night for a pee. So to me, like this is like really beautiful and it's like a lot of support being given to this person. And, pregnancy, again, it's no joke. Like even people who are having lovely pregnancies tend to need a lot of support. And it's great to have that. We have spoken to her gynecologist, and my daughter-in-law is now on antipsychotics, which does make her feel better, but she still has bouts of anxiety and asks for my son often. So there are a lot of like uses for certain antipsychotics that are not related to someone experiencing psychosis. Sometimes people are given them for anxiety because they can be very sedating. Some of them are really helpful for nausea or for hyperemesis. Like there's lots and lots of reasons why someone can be given this that have nothing to do with psychosis. Right now, my son visits every Friday and leaves on Sunday mornings. Now, the fact that like the son's only around on the weekend, it kind of bugs me because I'm just like, okay, you're just like missing out on your partner's entire pregnancy, but okay. I have asked my son to call her often, but he gets into arguments with me saying he doesn't have time, even though he finishes work at latest by 6. Calling her every day would definitely help my daughter-in-law a lot. Besides that, I really think having a familiar face would help. So 3 days ago, I asked my son if my daughter-in-law's parents could move over from their home country for the time being and stay over at his house. My son says that would be an inconvenience and he'd have to pay for their living expenses. So I countered that I would chip in a bit. It was also absolutely shocked to find out that my son and daughter-in-law minimized her HG issue and was lying to her parents that everything was still manageable. My son said it was not happening and that he would not be able to function properly with everyone in the house. I got very frustrated and called daughter-in-law's parents and told them the reality of the situation. They were disappointed, but also concerned and eager to help out. So the thing is, it can be true. This could be true that it would be very disruptive for him. He might have anxiety issues. He might have sensory processing issues. He might have all kinds of stuff going on. But that doesn't mean that you don't sort of negotiate when there's different sort of needs that are in conflict with each other, right? the whole idea of like my autonomy ends where your autonomy begins, and when there's overlap, we need to negotiate. And autonomy being like your inherent right to make decisions for your about what's best for your mind, your body, your spirit, your information, etc. So it could be true that this would be really, really difficult for him, and that like it would be incredibly disruptive for him to have everybody there, and he would be very stressed out, and it would affect his work, and he doesn't want to risk losing his job. Like all of these things could be true. And yet, if you're having so much difficulty with the idea of other people being in this, how are you going to handle a newborn? Like, that's my first question. It's like, I'm not saying that you like can't have a newborn if you have all these issues, but like the things I listed, but like you would need to figure out strategies for managing that, because you can't stop a baby from crying just by saying, "Hey, you're bothering me." Like it takes a lot of time. And you said, given how understanding they are with the daughter-in-law, I think if that was the case, they wouldn't put this on him so much. Yeah, I mean, yeah. There is the adage, like, if you spoil your kids, you have to raise your grandkids. And maybe there's some of that happening here, who knows? But it's still not an excuse for this person just kind of blanket refusing. And it's difficult. It's difficult. Okay. I confronted my son after the call, and he is extremely angry with me and his father. We both think that he needs to be more involved and empathetic, because once the baby arrives, it's only going to be worse, and we are getting old as well and can't be there for every step of the way. My husband assured me that I made the right decision, but my son is pretty bothered by it and thinks I'm being selfish and is just using an excuse not to take care of the daughter-in-law, even though I've been here for her for more of it than him. Daughter-in-law's parents will be arriving in a week, so I'm extremely grateful for that, but I still feel guilty if this was the right way to go about it. So the thing is here is like the right way to go about it, I don't think she's done anything wrong. Like calling this other person's parents, they also probably want to be invested in their daughter's well-being. They also have a right to know about like, how things are going. I mean, they do and they don't, right? The person, you can still keep information from your parents. It's fine. But yeah, disruption could mean that he doesn't get whatever he wants, as you say, around him, but it could also just be that like he's not been asked to do these kinds of things before in his life, and so he doesn't have any tools for dealing with this. But the thing is like the parents coming, this is the time to learn how to deal with this, because a kid is going to just be nothing but disruptions until they leave home. Yeah, the fact that he wouldn't even call her was a big red flag for me as well. Because there is an idea of like, not just what the mother in law has promised to do, because she doesn't really explain, like, I don't want to be a caregiver for my pregnant daughter in law because of my son. It's more that she doesn't know how she can get her son to realize he needs to be involved in his wife's pregnancy just as much as everything else, as everyone else, I mean. And so it's difficult. It's difficult. I think contacting the parents, as long as the daughter-in-law kind of knew and was comfortable with that information being shared, I think it's fine. And I think, like inviting the parents to come, fine. Like I know if I have a baby, I would love family to help out, and like, but not everybody does, right? Like there might be a reason why the daughter-in-law specifically was not telling the parents that isn't because her husband didn't want her to. Yeah, I think you're right, Aradan. Don't want to be the sole caretaker would be a better way to put it. Okay, so there's a little follow-up here. Thank you to everyone who has responded. I feel overwhelmed about how much worse this situation could be. As a mother both to my son and daughter-in-law, I feel deeply ashamed and worried about how callously my son behaved. My plan is to definitely sit him down and talk to him and mention some issues that people have brought up, including how he plans to take care of the baby if daughter-in-law is recovering and still mentally unwell, and whether his actions are just because of stress or if he is really neglectful. If he has become neglectful, I'd support my daughter-in-law in choosing what's best for her. My daughter-in-law would always have my unhindered support regardless, and she'd be staying with me and well cared for till her parents arrive, and afterwards as well if they need a break. I need to reflect and question my son on why he is behaving this way and resolve it as necessary. Thank you once again. So this is one of the biggest things here. This is one of the best ways forward. Understanding why is he behaving this way. Now, you might not get that information. You can only get it if the other person gives you an honest answer about these things. But he himself might not even know why, right? Like he could be having basically like a weird crisis inside of himself about the whole idea of having a kid, and like, people freak out. Some people kind of get weird when they're pregnant or their partner is pregnant or their kids are pregnant or their kids' partners. Like, it can be a lot. Miracle of birth, right? It's a lot for people, and maybe he's having a rough time and doesn't know how to adjust to it. Maybe he's like, this is the last bit of my youth or like freedom that I'm ever gonna have, and I want every second I can get of it. Maybe he's freaked out by the visceral reality of what is involved in pregnancy and childbirth. I mean, because of poor sex education, a lot of people have very, very weird rose tinted glasses about what pregnancy and labor and delivery are like, or like what recovery after having a baby is like. You said, Aradin, I wonder if once the baby comes, if he's going to ask his parents to help with the baby and if they could stay with him. I imagine so. So let's look at what a couple of people have said. This person has said that cannot be real. You're not the asshole. You and your husband sound pretty great for helping her so much. And your son, on the other hand, is a major asshole. An insult to trees. Sorry, but what? I don't know. What does an insult to trees mean? I don't understand. Sorry, but wow, on every level is he a selfish individual. Um, I think it's tough. This person says, I shudder to think of what kind of father he'll be. If this is his new style, he'll only want to partake in the fun parts and leave all the hassle to your poor daughter-in-law, and then he will try to hide from the world about how unsupportive he really is. Yeah. This is something to worry about, right? Sometimes people can come around. Sometimes people freak out. There was a really fun plot line in Orange is the New Black. Spoiler alert. If you don't know, here's the link to this Reddit, and I'll put the other one in because I forgot to. There's a thing where like one of the characters is pregnant and her husband is like, I'm gonna go on around the world trekking journey, and just kind of leaves her because he gets super freaked out. Things do not work out, if you can imagine, but some people it freaks them out in the extreme and they behave really erratically. And it's not an excuse, but it is a reason. So yeah. Okay. Let's shift to a different one. This is a relationship advice question. I'm going to put this in the chat as well. And it says here, husband upset at me because I didn't have a plan to go out the day after my grandmother's funeral. So this is pretty relevant because we've also been talking a lot about grief and also dying and all these other things on our Tuesday stream, sort of like how do we make the experience better, but then also how do we make the experience better for the people who are left behind, and the grieving process, what is that like? So let's read some more. We had both booked off work for a few days for our own leisure, but my grandparent happened to pass away on Thursday night. We spent most of the day Friday doing the religious funeral activities. In the evening, he asked me, so what's our plan for tomorrow? I said, let's go to XYZ maybe, or XYZ maybe. So he immediately got upset because I said the word maybe, repeating it under his breath, and got up and left the room. We didn't even try to speak all day yesterday. Usually he would try to call or talk to me, and we'd work it out, but he didn't, and I was too upset. I just asked him this morning what he was upset over, and yes, he's still upset because I used the word maybe, and feels like his vacation is coming to an end and he didn't get to do, quote, anything. So this is one of those things where it's like, okay, dude, it sucks. Vacations get disrupted all the time. It is not your partner's fault that their grandparent passed away. Uh, and these sorts of life events kind of take precedence over a lot of this other stuff. And like, yes, it's unfortunate, but it's lucky that you have these days off to like process this person's death and grieve and sort of come together in that way and support family. And, you know, maybe can be a word that's really stressful for people around plans. Like this can be a real difference between people. Like some people really want to have definitive plans. This was something Charlie and I had to actually work on because we had very different approaches when we first got together, where it's like, I like to make plans, but unless I'm making plans with somebody I'm not very close with, I like the plans to be really flexible because sometimes I wake up and I have a migraine, or I've got a lot of joint pain that day, or, something's not great. And, you know, that like I might wake up and just really not be in the mood for the thing that I said I wanted to do because, Charlie would ask me, hey, what do you want to do tomorrow? And I'd throw out ideas, but they were just literally what came into my head. They weren't necessarily like some deep, life plan where I like have to do this thing. And then sometimes I would wake up and I'd just be like so tired, or I'd be having a migraine or something, and I wouldn't like jump out the door to go do the thing I had suggested. Because to me, it was a suggestion. And to me, the flexibility of the plan and like allowing, or like, sometimes what would happen is we'd get into this like really deep, meaningful conversation with each other. And I would want to give that conversation time. I wouldn't want to like try to stop it so we could just go see this movie. I'm like, well, we can go see this movie anytime, but this conversation isn't necessarily going to come again. But for Charlie, this was really stressful for some reasons. Part of it was because it made it really hard for him to plan the other parts of his day and plan sort of like just anything, and having a plan really makes him feel a lot more comfortable. Whereas for me, having a plan can often feel really constraining. I see the benefits, but I tend to like to be a bit more free form. But it was also tough because, he would get excited for the thing we had said maybe to doing, and then not doing it was sad. And then, there were other things. It was just whiplash. It was just, we might end up doing nothing. And we didn't really communicate about this. And then it's also, Charlie's much more introverted than I am. I'm like very, very extroverted, very, very like, outgoing, spur of the moment kind of person. And Charlie's not. And so it would be very stressful for him. Hi, Critwitch. That we had this sort of difference. And basically it came down to both of us had expectations that we didn't realize we had, and that were also completely uncommunicated, which also meant that we both had needs that were not going to get met. And that was difficult. Like that wasn't a great way to do it. And so what we did is we kind of just figured it out. Like one day something came up and we were both kind of stressed about like how it was going. My go-to is to always just say like, hey, whenever there's like a thing happening, especially if we're not kind of sure like what's the deal with this experience, where like we both seem kind of in a bad mood or something's a bit off, it's just be like, hey, let's take a breather, let's center ourselves a little bit, and let's just sit down and kind of process together what's going on and figure it out. Especially if it's not clear, we might need to take some time. I don't like to let things fester. I used to do that because I'd be like, well, I don't want to bring it up right away, and like I need to think about it. No, I just made my relationships worse. It doesn't necessarily mean like I beat someone over the head with like we have to talk about it now. Like there's appropriacy as well, but like sometimes anyway, a lot of the time it's good to just like sit down and actually have the conversation right away. So we did, and we figured out, hey, this was actually a place where we weren't the most compatible. We're incredibly compatible about like pretty much everything else and like how we operate. And even though like I'm very extroverted and he's not, like we pair off really well together because I'm the type of introvert who usually likes, or I'm the type of extrovert who usually likes to have introvert friends where I can just like take them on an adventure and just be like, let's go. And like it works really well for me. But anyway, we're really compatible. So we kind of talked about it and we realized, okay, I like a lot of flexibility in plans. A lot of flexibility in plans makes him nervous. So I need to let him know ahead of time, am I really committed to the plan? And what are the things that might kind of stop it from happening? And then I also needed to be, more comfortable with actually sticking to plans we had made, especially, if Charlie's excited. But his sort of steps were he needed to actually communicate to me how badly did he need for us to like go out and do something. I can be, I'm very extroverted and very like outgoing and adventurous, but I'm also really content just staying home and reading a book or like playing video games. And like sometimes I'm like too content with it. And it's really good that Charlie drags me out of the house because otherwise I might not leave the house forever. And uh but we had to like really sit down and talk about this. And some of the things Charlie had to agree to was also like letting me know when a plan has become really important to him, letting me know when he was really feeling the need to get out of the house. And like we just communicated more about it and we were more honest about the things rather than because one of the things we hadn't communicated about is like we'd have a plan that in my head was like very tentative, like if the vibes are right, we'll go do this thing. And so I'd wake up and be like sleepy and very leisurely and kind of like blah the whole morning. And Charlie's like, I'm ready to go. When are we going? I'm ready to go. Anyway, you get it. You can see what's happening here. Let me see what people said in chat. Araden, you said, yeah, I like to have firm plans with people. I very rarely make plans with people anymore. Also, in the past, I've had a lot of people say, let's do something, but nothing else. And it would never come to anything. So now I tend to assume non-firm plans aren't actually going to happen. So yeah, my instinct was also like, I would make plans with people, or I would suggest let's do something, or I would invite them to something. But it was usually something like I was really gonna do. And I expect a certain number of people to cancel. Like I hung out with some friends. I went for a walk in a park earlier today and we talked about like socialist theory and like Zizek and stuff. We just did a bunch of nerdy stuff together and we like walked in the park for several hours. But we were still arranging like the fine details last night, like where exactly we're gonna meet. So I said to them, hey, if I'd still really like to meet tomorrow. I know I'm kind of like we're still working it out really late. It's okay if arranging plans this short schedule is stressful for you and you want to do something else later, but I'd also still love to meet because I try to be really accommodating for this. Okay, Crit, what you said, life happens, so being flexible makes things simple. I like the mindfulness you apply. Thank you. Aradin, I can be like letting the poison out of a wound. Yeah. Uh, let's see here. Coke float, nice. Aradin, I would rather someone make firm plans and then have to cancel or adjust them than leave them vague. My plans these days are all online plans, not going out plans. I think I'm now an official hermit. Yeah. I mean, they used to be a job. Could do it. And just dispense strange wisdom to passing travelers on occasion. Anyway, let's continue here. I tried to explain that my use of the word maybe didn't mean I didn't know if I wanted to, just that I was giving suggestions. He starts telling me I never make plans. So this is one of those things. Remember we talked about the like cognitive distortions, and one of the things that we do that really can make things worse both in our own minds and when we're interacting with other people is using these absolute words. Never, always, every time, forever. These kinds of things, it's generally not true. You never do these things. I never make any plans. Probably, if you actually looked it all out, it's not true. And even if it were, this isn't really communicating things. What would communicate more is that, like, hey, I feel like I make the majority of plans and the one who's the most committed to things. It's a big cognitive load for me to constantly have to be the person planning entertainment for us. And I would love it if we could be more of a team about this rather than you never make plans. And like, you can see the difference here. Obviously, like I'm putting a certain kind of like tone of voice to each thing. But even if you put less of an aggressive tone of voice to the you statements, they still tend to come across this way. So this is where a simple thing can result in people being the asshole, right? Because if you have expectations that you don't realize that you have, or you don't communicate them, or both, and then you get into this sort of cognitive distortion space, you're likely going to act in a way that is not beneficial to your connection with this other person, you're likely to feel worse, and you're also not likely to get what you want. Oh, hey, Trooper. Thank you. Welcome. I'm so happy you're here. Uh, so yeah, like this is one of those things where it's like it makes sense for people to get upset. It makes sense for people to, you know, feel like there's whiplash with like plans getting canceled. Yes, losing your vacation sucks, but the thing, it's not even about that. It's about like how did this communication break down? And what are maybe some habits, you know, we have limited information here that could have made this less nice for people. Because like if you get into this place where you are quote unquote the asshole and you have this really negative interaction with each other and then you get what you want out of that where the person says okay fine we'll go do this thing. I mean, I think for a lot of people, oh thank you anonymous gifter. That's really lovely. For a lot of people that's an unsatisfying thing because they've kind of keyed themselves up so much that like they're ready for it to become more of an argument and then the person just saying like fine yeah we can do what you want, uh, it can be difficult. So this is one of those things where coming back to those skills we were talking about earlier, and I want to talk about one other skill that we mentioned. So we talked about dear man, but we have these other skills, which is give and fast. This is sort of like this interpersonal effectiveness, sort of trifecta of skills. Because remember, in communication theory, as I mentioned earlier, there's like three general goals that you can have in an interpersonal situation: getting what you want, maintaining the relationship, and maintaining self-respect. Usually those three things are in harmony. Sometimes there's one or two in tension. You might have to sacrifice one in order to get another. So one of the other things you can do is the relationship effectiveness, and it's these give skills. Basically gentle, interested, validate, and easy manner. So when you get into this kind of situation where like, hey, communication really broke down, it's surprising. Why did communication break down so quickly? I don't understand quite what this person is thinking that made them so upset. And now I'm feeling upset. Like we're both kind of getting dysregulated. Very, very, very common pattern to get into. It's if any of this stuff is like resonates for people, I want you to know like none of this is abnormal. It's on Reddit relationship advice questions because and like with many answers, usually because it's something that a lot of people can relate to. Uh, and at least like one other person in the world can relate to it. um, okay, so the gentle here is you want to, you know, be kind, courteous, refrain from personal judgment, and try to avoid again you statements and try to keep it focused on I statements. Like, I feel this way, not you do this thing. And, you know, you could also, as it says here, you want to avoid using this word but. Try using and where you would normally use but. This is just a small thing, but it can really actually reduce emotional intensity and defensiveness. Sometimes people will like know that you're doing this and get upset about it and then just be like, oh, you're manipulating me. And, you know, we can't win every. This is again about risk reduction, not sort of perfection. Um, and you could say, you know, I hear what you're saying and this is my point. It's more effective than saying, I hear what you're saying, but. So like an and. You can even say like no and instead of no but a lot of the time. Um, yeah, exactly. Don't globalize your opinions and feelings. You know, and you don't want to make these sort of like absolutist statements, especially about the other person. Trooper said, oh, we were talking about I statements. I have some problems with the way I statements are framed and used. I used them, but I feel like they can be very damaging. I mean, I think that this is, or I use them. You know, I also think that it's one of those things where it's like, you're right. It can be one of those things where people start to become really self-defeating in it and overly self-critical or even too self-referential, especially if the situation isn't really about yourself and you're using a lot of I statements. But it can also be weaponized to say, like, you can't actually talk about what's happening. You have to only talk about yourself. or something. Like for sure, it can be, none of these skills are perfect, and every skill can definitely be weaponized. And I'd love to hear more from you, Trooper, about what it is that you feel is a problem with it. Um, yeah. The way I would really stress it is when expressing the sort of like reason for being unhappy with a situation, start with this is the impact the situation is having on me, rather than this is the intention you must have for doing this thing. Because this is often what we're trying to differentiate, like intent versus impact. I can't actually know the other person's intent unless they give me a truly honest and self aware assessment of their own intentions. And, but I can say, usually with more surety, what impact something is having on me or what I'm experiencing. And so that's sort of how I would say is like the sort of generally safer way to do the I versus you statements. Like stick to impact it is having on you versus what you think the other person's intentions are. And people sometimes use I statements to like actually talk about the other person. Like, it makes me think that you must be a terrible person. And it's like, that's not exactly it. Okay, so some other things is like, again, listening for actual understanding. You know, if you both have expectations that you don't even realize you have, you're not going to get to that very likely unless you're actually trying to work together to figure out what is this person, what's going on, with them, and why are they feeling this way, and spending some time together. You know, these things can be really cultural, you know, things like culture around interrupting or not interrupting, how much time people are expected to take when speaking or before replying to a question. These things are really cultural. This is definitely written for like sort of very particular Western context, and it's not always effective, but you know, showing that you're actually listening to what the other person is saying, generally speaking, is pretty good idea, whatever that looks like in whatever culture you're part of. And then validating. And validating is also one of these words that often gets misused and misunderstood. Okay, wait, I want to see what people are saying here. Aradin, yeah, makes me think of the ring theory of expressing your feelings, or they use I statements to center themselves in any situation, even if it really has nothing to do with them. Yeah, absolutely. I totally think that that can happen, Aradin. And Critwitch, do you mean that I in the world in my view, I may have missed something in the convo. What we were talking about earlier, Critwitch, was the whole like avoid using, we were talking about and dear man, avoid using the I statements, for example, I feel, or avoid using you statements. I feel sad when you don't call, rather than you make me feel sad when you don't call. This is more focusing on like what impact is it having on me, this thing I want to talk about. But as Aradna is saying, like you can also use it to kind of hijack what the conversation is about. Or what the situation is about. Validating is also one of those things, as I was mentioning, that can be really weaponized and it can be misused, and also people can sort of like misunderstand what it means. Validation does not have to mean agreement, and validation just means I accept that your experience of reality is true for you. And it can be a very effective tool for helping people feel that they are being heard. It's best when it's done sincerely. You don't necessarily have to validate everything. You always have choices in all of these things. But yeah, it just means that you acknowledge that a person expressed their feelings. Like someone says that they're having a really hard time, and you can say, yeah, I understand that you're having a really hard time. Like that's often all it has to be is validating. It's just kind of saying, yes, I hear what you're saying. And it says here, for example, if your sister is frustrated because no one ever listens to her, you would validate her by saying it makes sense to feel frustrated when it seems like no one ever listens to you. So here, you're not saying, you're right, no one ever listens to you. Just saying, yeah, I understand why you would feel frustrated when it seems like this is happening. The key point to remember is that the goal is to acknowledge, not necessarily agree with the person's emotion or thoughts. If you agree, you can genuinely just agree, and that can still be a validation. It doesn't always have to be this very, like, diplomatic, tactful sort of way of doing things. There are lots of other ways. And validation can also just be like, damn, that sucks. Or like, woo, like you can also just like express and reflect back. Because remember, we talked about very long time ago, we talked about active and reflective listening, and we said that you can reflect back what a person is saying, like the content, you can reflect back emotions, and you can reflect back actions. And reflecting back emotions doesn't have to be you saying, it sounds like you're stressed. It can be just like, woof, that's difficult. Like you can just kind of reflect it back in other ways as well. And that can also be really validating. Not for everybody, right? There's no way to be perfect at any of this. Human communication and interaction, it's all beautiful, messy, difficult, lovely. When it works, it's great. A lot of the time we're lucky. Anyway, and the other thing is it can be helpful to use an easy manner. Uh, Coming in and just like it can be tough if you're already stressed by the conversation that you're having or the situation at hand. If you're really confused, like in this situation, I would be really confused if Charlie was just mad at me because like I didn't have plans for what we were going to do on our days off after I just went to a funeral. Like I would probably kind of be like, yeah, I don't even know. And it can be tough to go into that conversation. Let's just read a little bit more of what this person says. In all honesty, we don't really go out much, but it's always a mutual decision. We usually take it day by day, and most days he doesn't even want to go out. We'll just stay home and play video games or cook or go for neighborhood walks or visit family. He works from home and has a very relaxed job, so it's not like he never gets time off. And he just had a week off a month ago and another week off coming up in December. I'm just very upset and frustrated that he got angry at me about plans given the context of the situation. It's not like I even said I wanted to do something. So this is one of those things where it's like, again, different expectations it seems like they might be having, but it's also, one of those difficulties that can come up with you might be feeling some kinds of grief. Remember, we looked at this big chart of like different sort of typical expressions of grief and different types of grief that people can feel on a Tuesday stream, if you watch those. And let me actually just pull that resource up really quickly since I'm talking about it. Give me just a second. This supplement here. And remember I said normal grief reactions. We don't want to use that word. We can just say typical. But there's all different types of grief. And it could be a situation where both of them are kind of dealing with this, where like, this person's grandmother dying could make this person also think about their grandparents dying or their own mortality or whatever. Like, and they could be having these reactions, but you're not going to kind of get there if the conversation just kind of escalates and escalates and people get more and more riled up. Anyway, this situation. Let's do another one. A Rodden, yeah, he's just not being at all considerate of the situation. I mean, it's really tough because I don't actually know. I mean, like we never have the other person's perspective, which is one of my least favorite things about these is that like I would love to have the other person's perspective because this is also one of those things that's really gray about consent and really gray about a lot of communication is like, even when you have both people's perspective, it's not necessarily helpful. They can both be very persuasive and like they might both be trying to convince you of something, but also like a lot of these things are muddy and not clear. Like we really don't want to think of it as these really discrete, like right and wrong all the time. And yeah, it's one of those things that's tough. And it's one of the ways where it can be really tough to know if you're being the asshole or not. All right, so let's look at this next one. This one, actually, I want to skip this one. I didn't really like this one very much. I don't really like a lot of them that have to do with money. A lot of the time they just make me sad. Okay, this one's much more interesting. Not wanting to adopt my stepdaughter. So I have been in my stepdaughters' lives since they were 12 and 11. They are great girls, but when they were young, they made it very clear that they didn't want another dad. I was much more of a friend than a father to them, even though in the beginning I wanted to be more. I know it was wrong to push to be their dad, and I took a sideline to their bio dad. Both girls are in their 20s now. Their bio dad is a piece of work, to put it lightly, and he would go in and out of their lives. Well, he is completely out of the picture now. He disappeared. No one knows where he is, and the girls have accepted that he is gone from their lives now. It's been a rough year. Today was my birthday, and as a gift, I got adoption papers from both of the girls. I froze, and I said no to both of them. I don't have that type of relationship with them, and I worry that if the bio dad pops in again, I will be pushed out again. I told them I don't think it's the right call, even if they're adults, and I don't support them. This is not a good idea, especially since they are grieving. So again, this comes back to, emotional intensity, increasing risk in consent. The more activated you are, whether it's excited, happy, sexually aroused, grieving, sad, stressed, it reduces our capacity to be able to listen to our bodies about what we're experiencing and what actually feels consensual to us. So they got really quiet, and the oldest blew up, and we got into an argument with each other. She called me an ass in the end and told me I clearly don't love her. Everyone is mad at me, and I was asked to leave for the night. I don't know if I'm being an ass or not. How do I fix this? So this is really difficult. Like, this freeze response here, right? This is a stress response. This is clearly very stressful for him, and he does not need to adopt his daughters, and he does not need to adopt his daughters or his stepdaughters to give them a sense of like the catharsis or the corrective experience they might need to deal with their father basically abandoning them. And they can't use this guy as this therapeutic tool, right? He's not a therapeutic tool. He's a person. He doesn't feel comfortable with this. He does not have to do this, right? 1 second. Now it's tough because these people are grieving, right? And the going through the effort to get adoption papers together, that's probably a lot of work for them. And I think that you're right, Arad, and I definitely agree with you. I don't think anyone's actually being an ass here. I think there's just a lot of complicated feelings going on, and people are having a hard time, but it's one of the things I want to talk about it through the lens of consent, right? There's this intensity that makes consent riskier here. They made it very clear they didn't want another dad, so it set this sort of expectation. And he doesn't feel like a father to them and does not want to be a father to them. Like, he worked very hard to respect what it was they asked for. Now, they were very, very young when they asked for this, but it seems, as indicated here, that it was not an ask that they updated or changed, right? So he continued to work within the consent framework that they had of what is the nature of this relationship and what are the boundaries here with each other. And it seems like he was very measured about this. Now, again, we don't have everybody else's perspectives. I would love to know their mother's perspective on this, especially if the mom asked him to leave for the night, what's going on there. But it's also true, like, hey, if the dad pops in again, this is going to be awkward. Like, this could become a problem. Also, they're in their 20s. Do they really need to be adopted? And this is kind of a weird situation. But if he's got this freeze response here and feels really clear that it is not appropriate and not the relationship he wants to have, that's the way it is. And he's not required to do this. Yeah. So, I mean, there's very little that I could get from their point of view that would change my opinion about this, to being honest. And I'm just one person, and my opinions are not perfect. There are many, many things that, like, I can get wrong. But to me, looking at it from the lens of consent, this guy does not want to consent to adopting them. And he has very good reasons for doing that. And it's both something intellectual and like somatic in this experience of wanting to give a no. And he wants to give a no, and that needs to be respected. I really want to stress that, like, you're allowed to say no to these kinds of things, whether it's sex, whether it's a contract, whether it's, like adoption, whether it's a relationship of any kind, regardless of the reason. But this person seems to have some very good reasons. And not wanting to be somebody's psychological catharsis does not mean that you don't love them. There's many different ways to love a person. All right, okay. Yeah, somebody's saying it's making the rounds and it's maybe fake. Or hold on, what did I say here? This scenario has been making the rounds on social media. It's usually exactly the way you describe. For the stepfather's birthday or at Christmas, the stepfather opens the adoption papers given by the teenager adult children, and then he cries while they all hug. They may have seen these videos going around and wanted to make you feel accepted and thank you for the support you've given them. Sure. They maybe got this idea. This could be helpful for like the relationship going forward. Like if there is going to be any attempt at repair, understanding where they may have come from can be really helpful. And he might not have access to that information right away and may need to kind of figure out like what's kind of going on here. And this next person replied, and those videos are beautiful, but much like big proposals, it's something you should know the answer to before you ask. For everyone's sake, I wish OP stepdad had done, our stepkids had done a simple, hey mom, we're wondering how stepdad would feel about adopting us. Could you subtly find out, or whatever? OP, you're not an ass. You did the right thing. I'm not surprised they're hurting now. And I would agree with this. Big proposals are one of those things where they, to me, are really risky consent wise. Doesn't mean that they can't be completely consensual, because they can be. It's again, the risk is just higher because there's all of this social pressure. And it's something that for many people is a very private thing that is now made very public. Even just like a lot of public proposals, like in a restaurant, get a lot of attention, and people can feel pressured to say yes for the sake of not wanting to make a scene or cause some kind of problem or like embarrass this person publicly, or of course being afraid of how this person will react if you say no. And some people though really like the big public proposal. They like the attention, they like the witnesses. One of the better ways, we talk a lot about how to reduce consent risk. It often is slow down and get more information. And so knowing ahead of time as much as possible, is this person likely to say yes to marrying me, for example? And are they likely to feel comfortable with me proposing to them in public? There are ways to do it subtly. You watch some chick flicks or something and you've got the public proposal and you say like, oh, don't you think this is so romantic? If they are like, yes, it's so beautiful, I would love that. Okay, maybe you've got some more information. Or if they're like, oh my gosh, no, it's so creepy or so stressful. I proposed to Charlie, and before I proposed to Charlie, we kind of talked about it quite a bit. And the first time I was thinking of doing it, Charlie gave me the indication that it was too soon, that he didn't feel ready for it. I'm much older than him. I have a lot more life experience, or had a lot more life experience at the time that was really relevant. And I was sad, but I was also like, cool, like I need to know this information. So I waited. I waited another like 6 months. And then the kind of dancing around it, kind of talking about it indirectly, conversation came back up, and Charlie was much more comfortable with the idea. And I still waited longer after that. And then, you know, but I didn't just spring it on him because it wasn't about me, it was about us. And I really wanted to make sure it was something that like he was comfortable with. However, there could be other people for whom it not being this big, gigantic surprise extravaganza thing is going to be disappointing to them. again, the way you reduce the risk there is you slow down and get more information. Try to learn these things about the person. You might mess up still, but it's a way to reduce risk. Whistler, you said, my knee-jerk reaction to is to side with the daughters here. This is purely symbolic and there's no harm in saying yes, but there is harm caused by saying no. I think that's an interesting perspective. I think that like it's purely symbolic. It might be. There could be other things that could come up that are you know, yeah. There could be other things that come up. And, it's one of those things too where it's tough because like yes, it's symbolic and yes, it might help them with their grieving, but like is that something that he is required to do? No. It's a legal contract and it's a kind of a big thing and yes, it's mostly symbolic, but that might be a symbol that he's not comfortable with. Let me see. Trooper, you said, I often think about how some people's no's are not considered important. Yeah, totally. So, for example, in this situation, they seem to assume that the consent that matters is the daughter's. They didn't want adoption, so he didn't. Now they want adoption, so he should, of course, say yes. He's not a person whose consent is considered. It's assumed to be acceptable to override his feelings, his wants and needs. If it doesn't matter if he wants to do this thing or not, he's expected to go against his consent. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely the sort of perspective that it seems to be that the people around him are having. You know, the initial situation of the stepdaughter saying that they don't want another dad, this is one of those things where it's like his consent matters here for sure, but also their consent matters in terms of they're setting a boundary here about what kind of relationship they're comfortable with having with this person and how far they want to progress it. Probably this took some negotiating over years. Consent and boundaries are also always a process of discovery. Like perfect pre-planning a lot of time isn't possible. People might think they know what they want and then later realize that things have changed, right? They knew what they wanted at the time and then what they wanted has evolved over time. It's awesome if you can communicate about that, but people often aren't aware of these things. So again, discovery, assessment, communication, checking in. Consent is discovery is often a big part of that. And it doesn't mean discovery as in like I'm going to use you to discover myself and my boundaries. It's more like people often, each person in the situation doesn't know everything about themselves and can't perfectly predict the future and can't know exactly how things are going to feel or what it's going to be like. And they may think they want something or think they don't want something, and then exploration may happen. Maybe is also a powerful word in consent, and like, let's try until I say no. These are also ways people can do things. Discovery does not have to mean you are somebody else's plaything or experiment. Absolutely not. That's not what I'm talking about. It means more. It takes time for people to really process what's going on psychologically, emotionally, somatically. Like these are things that are not often clear right away. And it can take time for people to sort of settle into things to really be able to listen to or sense what's going on inside of them and to get to what they want. And so with this early situation of like, they say, hey, we don't want this relationship, it seems like this person was like, okay, they said they didn't want another dad and I respected that. That sounds okay. But to just kind of say, now we have to flip the whole thing and expect you to immediately conform to this new request for a completely different type of relationship, it can be a lot. And it does seem to be a lot. Aradin, said, I think the whole big romantic, life-changing surprise thing has been so romanticized as this wonderful, great thing when in reality, it very rarely works out the way it does in movie and TV shows. I think it can work out fine. I think a lot of people like reality matching, the wonderful symbols that we have in our head is really lovely for a lot of people. And that's true for them. And, I'm more worried about like the Christmas commercials where someone just buys you like a $60,000 car for Christmas. I mean, Charlie and I are never going to have the kind of money where like purchasing a car as a surprise gift is going to be something where I'm not like, oh my gosh, why did you not talk to me about this first? Like, well, how much was the loan you took out? What are the monthly payments going to be? Also, like, we hate cars. Like, what is the deal? Like, anyway, there are people for whom getting surprised with a car is going to be an absolutely appropriate and wonderful gift. Mostly rich people, but not exclusively. Um, but again, it comes down to like slowing down and finding out more information and checking in. And so it does not sound like anybody had sort of checked in with this guy to see like, is he actually going to be comfortable with this? And like, it's, yeah, I mean, his feelings here really do matter as well. And he might want to like, the other aspect of this is he's older, probably has a lot more life experience than these two people in their 20s, and may want to attempt repair in the relationship, and probably more responsibility is going to come on to him for simply because of being older and having more life experience, and probably, though not always, more tools, and also just social and cultural expectations, things we expect of men, things we expect of older people, things we expect of people who act as fathers, etc. It's going to be expecting him to sort of try to like bridge the gap. Um, so yeah, it's not a situation I would want to be in, for sure. But in this relationship, they may attempt to repair it. I think it's really tough too because if these two people, the children are really sort of grieving their father and having a lot of feelings about that situation, and now they're mad. This stepfather is a safer target. This is a very, very common thing that people can do when they're really upset about something, but they cannot actually process the thing that they're upset about. It's too big, or it's not safe, or the person that they need to process it with is no longer there, whatever. Not everybody does this, and this is not the only thing that happens, but it can be that people will sometimes express their anger, their frustration, their hurt to somebody who is not actually the person they want to speak to, but someone who is simply an easier, softer target. It happens a lot in workplaces, right? Where like a big project goes wrong, something fails, there's something that didn't work out well. And rather than sort of just saying, okay, it's life, things went wrong, we can't get mad at the universe, or, owning it yourself, which is if you're the boss and it's scarier and riskier to say, like, I made a mistake, then sort of putting it all onto this one person. Okay. Rodney said, I think he could have handled the response better, although his response was very understandable, and asked why and what was behind this, and then had a conversation about it, which, even if it didn't go forward with the adoption, they would know the reasons why and didn't get to have a sharp rejective no. Again, though, this is the kind of thing that should really be discussed and not sprung on anyone. Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, like, I think that it's tough because, yeah, how do I want to say this? I think for a lot of people, especially if you're in this sort of like freeze reaction, right? So this would be, assuming that this is what is happening, it's likely what we could consider like a vasovagal response, which is basically the fight or flight, which is actually like fight, flight, freeze, fawn, fatigue, fix and fake are also in there. These stress and trauma responses. These are things you have no control over. It is not something you can like train yourself out of. And it is something that your autonomic nervous system and the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, they're all the things that sort of mediate this, are coordinating together. And it's going to reduce your ability to sort of like act skillfully, whatever that means in any situation. Though skillfully sometimes just means like didn't make anybody sad. Doesn't necessarily mean skillful. It could mean diplomatic or tactful. But, you know, not necessarily being able to be at your best and have the most like kind and reasoned discussion is not always going to be possible. And this is one of those things where like sometimes you are the asshole and it's also okay, right? This is one of the reasons why I wanted to pick this as sort of our last one, is because like sometimes it's just life and you're going to react in a way where like it makes people feel like shit and people are mad at you, and it's also was a completely okay response to have. And we can't sit here and watch how this conversation went. Like maybe, yeah, it was like really cruel and really harsh. And, you know, maybe it was very like gentle and reasoned and like, loving. And maybe it was somewhere in between. Maybe it was really dysregulated if this person's kind of in a bit of a acute stress response, the whole freezing up. And like, it also is likely as soon as when freezing up happens or some other of these stress responses, you can have like the blood drain out of your face, you can have your heart start racing, your blood pressure can change, you can have, like feel like you're shaking. There's all these different things that go into it. Again, we have the class coming up next Saturday if you want to learn more about these sort of acute stress and trauma responses and their impact on people's behavior and cognition, and also how to like manage them. But it's difficult, right? Like this person, clearly this is kind of rough for them. And they may have a ton of feelings about this whole being told, we don't want to have you as another dad. Like, trying to be a friend rather than a father. This, maybe took a lot of effort and was maybe painful for this person. We don't know. And this whole freeze response could also be related to sort of all of this other stuff. Who knows? But I'm not surprised that this conversation was not necessarily the most effective, because this is a really big emotional thing that they're asking of him. And he's telling them no. They're already in a state of grief and upset and like, difficulty. There's definitely some amount of symbolism here that's going to be beneficial for them. Potentially, though, in some ways it might be more harmful long term, especially if later, what if they found out that like something happened to their dad, their biological father, and he was like in a coma for like 2 years, and it's like, like there's all these things that could happen that could make it so that him actually signing these papers could be actually have been very coercive or like not very consensual, because they're in this state of grief and they might really come to regret it later. It's not a good idea to sign big legally binding things when like big griefs or big, difficult emotions are involved. It's one of those things where like talking about a lot of like these hospital ethics boards, a lot of the time their ethics is much more about like sometimes about genuine like ethics and the way we tend to think about ethics, but it can also be more about like liability and like kind of keeping the hospital having like plausible deniability for certain actions that they have. Because it's not that uncommon for people to be asked to make these huge decisions right after, they're in horrible, excruciating pain, or they're like, don't actually have all the information and aren't given time to get all the information, or like, in a state of grief. Trooper said, for some people, even if he were gentle, the very act of refusing the adoption, regardless of what he wants or what his boundaries are, he will be the asshole. Yeah, for sure. This is also tied into societal gender norms about femininity being fragile and needing protection, while masculinity is stoic and providing 100%. And this is one of those things that also really complicates the discussions of consent, which is that like a lot of the time, I was listening to some people, I think one of the other Consent Academy volunteers recently taught a consent basics workshop in a swingers club. And you don't need to know a lot about the swinger world, but one of the things to know is that like a lot of the time they're very gendered spaces, not always. Again, if there's any swingers here, like please no shade. I'm not like shading you, and please don't get mad at me, because this is not like a criticism situation, but they can be very gendered, and there can be a lot of like the women are basically allowed to go like do whatever they want to any of the guys, but a guy has to ask the other guy's permission, right? They're very heteronormative and very gendered. The only like sort of inverse thing is that like the sexual overtures of women are, well, it is kind of heteronormative because they're seen as non-threatening and they're seen as, like innocent and allowed. But if one of the men wants to sort of interact with one of the women, generally speaking, he's supposed to go ask that person's spouse for permission. And we were teaching there, and some of the people were, like men were saying, I didn't even realize I was allowed to say no to women's sexual advances to me, or to like tell them not to touch me in certain ways or talk to me in certain ways, not just in this swingers club, but like in general in life. And I think that that's incredibly common, especially because we have this narrative around men and men's sexuality as being inherently like dangerous and predatory and like all of these really just like very dehumanizing, very harmful stereotypes, which then also often makes it so that a lot of men can feel like in sexual spaces they can't actually connect with their wants, their needs, their desires, even if their desire is to say no, because connecting with that at all is going to like unleash the beast that they're terrified they might have inside of them, because this is what society tells them all the time. And it's really messed up and like heartbreaking. Yeah, but I think it's one of those things that gets really, really complicated. And then when a lot of men are fragile not fragile, vulnerable. That's what I'm trying to say. When they're very vulnerable, I was thinking about Trooper, where you're saying like femininity is being fragile, needing protection. But when men are vulnerable and sort of like actually express their wants and needs in these spaces, yeah, that can be seen as like toxic or predatory or something really negative, but can also just be so jarring to people because they're so sure that like their needs and wants are going to be prioritized. Yeah, I mean, yes, Rodden, and I think even with asexuality, so many of these like gendered norms and expectations still are gonna happen in just general interactions with people. Um, yeah, thank you for the additions, Trooper. I really appreciated it. So yeah, I really feel for this guy, and this is why I wanted to pick this one, because we have this sort of question about like, how do you know when you're being the asshole, and like what can you do to avoid it? Is to stress that like sometimes doing the right thing, doing the thing that is actually consensual, and especially respecting your own consent and boundaries, is going to make other people call you the asshole, and there's nothing you can do about it. And it maybe to them in their reality you are the asshole. It doesn't mean that in like the sort of most pure sense of the, I don't know, some sort of ancient Greek philosophy, you are like the perfect characteristic and expression of assholery or something. But that it's yeah, I mean, like it does not mean your essential character is such, but it's also, doesn't necessarily make it true. Trooper, you said there was an interesting article I read about how I statements can be harmful to women, often because this sort of non-direct language and basing things in the woman's feelings aligns with. Oh, thank you for the follow, Roches. Welcome. Aligns with societal stereotypes of women's emotionality. And if the person you are talking to doesn't care about what the woman's feeling, that makes it easy to dismiss what that woman is saying. And this can be disastrous if the woman is, say, a boss and the person being the problem. Oh, thank you, Trooper. I appreciate the follow. And the person being problem is sexually harassing a subordinate. For sure. I mean, I think that this is one of those things where context is really important. And like, if somebody is sexually harassing me and I go like, it makes me feel really uncomfortable when these things happen, and I don't even name what the person is doing, and I don't name that like this person is the actual person acting, and like none of that is happening, yeah, like that is not a good context for those things. And yeah, for sure. Like a lot of these things, and this is just true of like most psychological sort of advice in general, is really incredibly context dependent, whether the context is the person, the situation, the time of day, the like cultural context, like any of these things, right? Like they all have impact on it. And it's yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So if somebody was sexually harassing me, the thing I can say is, hey, this behavior, and I would name exactly what they're doing, is absolutely not appropriate in the workplace, and you need to stop doing it right now, especially if I'm the boss. So that's how I would respond to it. You don't have to respond the same way as me, rather than saying, it makes me feel really sad when you touch me in this way or something. Trooper, you added, and a lot of the self help versions of this advice is very, very contextless very often. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of the things that's so tricky. And this is one of the things that, like, when we do these Twitter, or not Twitter, Reddit sort of analysis things, it's not me coming in and saying I have the right answer. I don't. I'm just one person with my thoughts and feelings and life experiences. It's, I can be wrong. I can have biases, or I mean, I do have biases. And but it's more that I think that for a lot of these situations, we can help ourselves with processing it by thinking about it from the lens of consent and boundaries. Consent and boundaries are not a tool that can be used in literally every situation. I mean, me and some of the other people at the Consent Academy like to like nerd in about it and like try to use it for everything, but sometimes it's really not the right tool. And other times it is really helpful because it takes these big, messy, complicated situations like this one we're reading here, and I can just say, you're allowed to say no to whatever somebody's asking you to do in these kinds of situations, regardless of the reason. I've been in classes where we've talked about like informed consent and saying like, withholding information from a potential sexual partner that would have changed their mind had they known it. Like saying, not being honest about being married and someone has sex with you and then they're like, oh my goodness, had I known you were married, I never would have had sex with you. And people have pushed back and they'd be like, oh, but that could just lead to discrimination. And like, what if a person doesn't want to have sex with someone because they find out who they voted for last room? And I always have to say, nobody owes anybody sex. A person can say no to having sex with you, even if it's for a messed up, bigoted, ridiculous, shallow, whatever reason. I once had somebody who was interested in dating me and then decided they weren't interested in dating with me because they realized I have two crooked teeth. And that, like, and I was like, cool, I'm not interested in you anymore. Nice. We avoided future more difficulties. But like, they communicated that to me, and I was just kind of like, okay. But like, I respected it. Right? I didn't try to convince them otherwise. I didn't try to tell them that's super shallow. I'm just like, all right, dude, you say you're not interested in me because of that. I hear you. Bye. And yeah, nobody owes anybody these sorts of things. This person does not. Yeah, wow, dodged a bullet there. We're still kind of friendly afterwards, because we saw each other a lot through work. We didn't work in the same place, but we worked for the sort of like same industry. And I had explained to them, because they asked me like, why had I never gotten braces, and I explained to them it's because my dad once said having crooked teeth made me look poor. And like, I was just really, as a teenager, like disgusted by this because we were poor and we lived in an incredibly poor town. And I did not like this idea. And I was kind of just like, ugh, I want to reject everything my dad. I mean, like, now I kind of regret it because the particular ways in which my teeth are crooked makes them much more prone to cavities. And I have to be like extra careful with certain things. And it's kind of a pain. And like, anytime something hits me in the face, I tend to cut the inside of my lip because these two teeth right next to the big teeth are like turned, so they like poke out a little bit. Yeah, it's a thing. um but it's, yeah, they were kind of like, oh, like, I kind of respect that, but also still I don't want to date someone with crooked teeth. And I'm like, cool, yeah, like, I'm good. Trooper, you said one of the tricks there is that there are many things about ourselves that a person doesn't know that you don't know is a big deal. Exactly. You don't know, you don't withhold because you're deceptive, but because you don't even realize that it'll be important to them. Yes, this is very much true. And this is one of those things where it's not, consent is one of these things we talk about a lot. It's not an absolute black and white. It's not like Either it was perfectly consensual and everything's amazing, or you're a terrible predatory abuser who needs to be in jail for all of eternity. Like, there are very few things where I'm like, yeah, that sounds like, I mean, like, yeah, I mean, my feelings on prisons, and I don't really want to get into that right now. But maybe I can imagine where that would be a response where I'd be like, yeah, okay. But for the most part, most consent incidents are things that are completely accidental and completely, like people have no ability to understand ahead of time necessarily that this is what's going to happen. And this is why we really stress at Consent Academy that our model is not a model for preventing consent violations or consent incidents. It is a way of reducing the risk of them happening. And so, if someone asks you if you're single and you dodge the question by saying, I'm not available for a relationship right now, when the reality is you're cheating on your spouse and you're technically in a monogamous relationship with them, you're not doing something like, consensual open relationships or polyamory. That's being deceptive. That's withholding essential information that the person has asked for. And maybe the person didn't totally understand. Maybe the person thought that they were just flirting, but still, it makes sense that this person would be upset. And there's still impact to consider, but it does not mean that this person is immediately like the worst person ever. It means something went wrong with consent. Someone feels hurt or harmed, or maybe they do. That's more like a violation. An incident is where people don't necessarily know how they feel, or something went wrong with consent and nobody feels like it's a thing. That happens a lot. Like every day, this happens to all of us multiple times a day. And consent is upheld and affirmed many times a day. And most of the time, we don't feel anything about that either. But it means that, like, okay, you'd want to understand what went wrong. How can we do better next time? And getting that information, right? We talked about slowing down, trying to get more information. There are things that increase risk, right? If I'm in, rope space, kink space, and I've got years and years of experience, and someone comes in who's never done any of that before, I have to be extra careful because I don't know what they don't know, and they don't know what they don't know. And so I would want to make sure I don't push this person outside of their boundaries. Maybe outside of their comfort zone is one thing. A lot of times people are okay with that, but outside of their boundaries is not what I would want to do. And sometimes that's the same line. In some context, that's the same line. But I would want to be a lot more, forthcoming with information. I'd want to walk them through a lot more. I'd want to really explain to them each thing I'm going to do before I do it, talk through the sensations, and then check in and like slow down, stop if they're not sure how they're feeling about it. Take some time and say, like, okay, you're not sure how you're feeling about it. Let's just stop here for a minute and let you kind of experience this. And then if you want to move forward, we can do that. Cool. And now maybe some people would come in and be like, oh, you're killing the vibe. I just want to like do whatever. That's not my risk profile. With a lot of these sorts of things, I really don't want to accidentally hurt people. And where I know the risk is really high, I like to be more cautious. That's my way of doing things. That doesn't mean it's the only right way. It is what makes me feel the most comfortable. And so there are other things in life where like I'm a lot more likely to just be like, okay, you say everything's good, let's give it a try. Where maybe the risk of harm is a lot lower. But this is sort of how I approach it. But again, it's only ever about risk reduction. We cannot prevent things from going wrong with consent. It's just going to happen. The inevitability of like miscommunication, not having the same definition of words, not always having the same understanding of things. Yeah. Trooper, what did you add? Or Aradin, you said boundaries and comfort zones aren't the same thing, even if they might often overlap. Right. Trooper, about informed consent, I'm thinking about rape by deception laws and when they have been used to prosecute someone and when they haven't. There was a case where a Palestinian Muslim man presented himself as Jewish and had a one-night stand with an Israeli Jewish woman. When she found out a week later that he was Muslim, she went to the police and they had him arrested for rape by deception. He got an 18-month prison sentence. I mean, yeah, this is one of those things where there's a lot of things I want to say this, but the first thing I want to say is that, like, with Consent Academy, our sort of perspective on consent intentionally does not try to align itself with the legal system. We are not trying to recreate justice systems in the world. We're not trying to sort of like work with the police. We're not trying to work in the legal system as it is. In fact, some of the things that we talk about don't match up very well with laws. Like Washington State, you legally cannot give consent to sexual activity and a bunch of other things if you've consumed any alcohol. And that's not how we teach consent. We say the more alcohol you've had, the more risk that there is that the consent's not going to be good, or that people are going to like have their consent violated. But that doesn't mean that you cannot ever have consensual sex under the influence of alcohol. It just means it's a lot riskier. And you have to decide how comfortable you are with that risk and how comfortable you are with the potential consequences, or like the potential harm you could do in taking those risks. So setting that aside, we don't really try to work within the justice systems. Things being unevenly applied, especially a lot of these laws, I don't have a ton of faith in this kind of stuff because, like, most of the time, in my experience, having talked to a lot of like lawyers, knowing people who work with the Innocence Project, which tries to get people who've been wrongfully convicted, get their convictions overturned, especially related to a lot of sexual assault and child molestation allegations. Um, you know, where these people actually do and don't get convicted often has a lot to do with politics. The politics of the judges or the district attorneys or whatever the body is that is deciding whether or not to bring charges and investigate things, the politics of the juries, the region that something is happening in is, and has very little to do with like, is this something we objectively feel is like universally an inappropriate way to do things? Because it's just, yeah, it's so unevenly applied. And a lot of the time, you know, there is something to be said for things being sort of handled and dealt with at a community level rather than at, you know, the legal system level. Like there's gaps for sure. There's a huge gap between like, you know, where most people live their lives and what the legal system can do. And also the legal system only has so many tools. And a lot of the time the tools that they have are not things that are actually going to be satisfying in the long term or promote healing or even prevent future harm. Trooper said about alcohol, I think it is interesting. All of those posters I've seen that say Jane had a drink, John had a drink, they have sex. John, you've just raped Jane, because having alcohol is seen to make it impossible for a woman to consent, but a man's consent and a heterosexual context is always assumed. Yeah, this is one of those things that, like, even as a teenager, I was like, something, I don't totally like jive with this. Like, something feels off here. And I had a teacher, my health teacher, literally said that it was impossible to rape a man. And I was just like, what the fuck? And I got in trouble for like, I got kicked out of class a lot as a kid. And this is one of the days where I got kicked out of class where I was like if we go by the one that was in place at the time, FBI definition of what constitutes rape and sexual assault, yes, sure. But if we talk about what we're really trying to talk about when we use this word and we talk about this topic, we're talking about sort of like certain types of acts that can harm and violate people in certain ways. And a lot of things can qualify as this. Not everything, and we don't want to dilute this word until it means nothing. We should still actually have, as much as possible, some boundaries for what we're actually going to call these different things. And yet she was just like, yeah, it's not possible. So like if a man has an erection, it basically means consent. And I was like, I don't think that's true, because like I've seen a lot of, well, this is what got me in trouble. I was like, a lot of dudes get in this class alone, I've seen get erections at times where they definitely don't want them. And yeah, that's why I got kicked out, because I was like, I don't actually think that's true. I don't think everyone can control it. And like also like what are we also talking about? There's like, it's not just to do with vaginas. Like there's lots of other things that can happen. Anyway, Yeah, it's always really, yeah, it's just very binary and very sexist and very patriarchal way to think about this. And it does a lot more harm than good because it leads people to have one idea of what one being a victim looks like. And even people who have been victimized can then be like, well, I don't fit this definition. Therefore, my pain is not real. My experience is not real. I'm just making it up or whatever. It can delay people getting help. It can make it so they never get help. It can make it so that they like deny what happened to themselves. But it can also, I think, go the other way where people are like, okay, this thing was something that like I actually feel like was okay, but there's such a strong cultural narrative that this thing is supposed to never be okay. Therefore, I must just be in shock. And that can be also really harmful. Um, Aradin, you said, yeah, it always assumed that men are always okay with sex. So, yeah, sounds like I had bad teachers. Yeah, for sure. I mean, health education in the US is pretty terrible. And anyone having sex with me isn't going to be consensual, for sure. Yeah. Trooper, which makes me think about all the prosecutions of trans men in the UK, where a couple of trans men had sex with girlfriends without disclosing that they were trans. And then these trans men end up getting arrested for rape by deception because they lied about being men, because trans men within a transphobic structure are seen as a woman who are deceiving others by pretending to be men. There's a long history of viewing trans people as fundamentally deceptive, which makes me uncomfortable. Yeah, I mean, this is one of those things that comes up a lot where it's like, you know, yeah, it's one of those ways where like more what I'm trying to say is like trying to put everything immediately into the justice system is only going to produce certain types of results, which is unlikely to actually be very helpful in so many things that are like, okay, things went wrong here, and maybe this person would not have said yes to this sexual encounter had they known that this person was trans because of how they feel about trans people. But that doesn't necessarily mean that this trans person is the person who did something wrong that needs to then like be corrected through the act of putting someone in prison as though that actually did anything. And it's just such a mess. There's been some really good lectures I've seen from some much older sort of like community social work type activism where it's sort of like not necessarily the professionalization social work, but sort of the in community stuff, who was talking a lot about like, you know, the way Reagan changed funding for local community projects and local community sort of like mutual aid things, and especially things like domestic violence shelters and everything, and sort of taking it out of the hands of the community, and the particular issues that happened as soon as infecting somebody else with HIV became criminalized, and who that harmed and who that punished, and like the way it changed a lot of people's experience of sexuality, the suspicion that it could lead to that was already in some ways happening because of the emergence of HIV, but really, really mutated through this process. And it took something that like, you know, there's pros and cons to trying to handle things just at like a community level, but it took something that, yeah, like it just criminalizes. I don't know exactly how I'm trying to say what I'm trying to say. I'm a bit tired, and I don't necessarily, this isn't something I've gotten like a perfect sort of workout for, right? I'm kind of just processing this, but it's something I think about often where I'm like, I feel like there's something here that kind of sucks. And like it isn't really what we're trying to talk about when we're talking about consent, and isn't really what like makes sense for the tools that the justice system has, and isn't necessarily going to produce results that are actually, you know, helping anybody, healing anything. You know, it's one of those things where like accountability, especially like transformative justice, has become really, really popular within a lot of like left leaning spaces, and people have gotten really interested in it, and they're kind of just decontextualizing all of this really big, important stuff and trying to put these cultural practices into place that mostly came out of Black and Indigenous cultural thought, because they're kind of mixing transformative and restorative justice together, and a lot of people don't necessarily know the difference. And people often want to talk about like accountability, And accountability is this like big word these days, and accountability processes. And there are limits to those, right? Like they can be real, they can be really helpful, they can be helpful for a lot of things when the community actually has the tools and the time and the energy and the knowledge to like really hold somebody in that way. But we often think about that like somebody who is harmed also has responsibilities. Their main responsibility, pretty much the only one they have, is their own healing. But the thing is, they can't put that on somebody else. And like punishing somebody is unlikely to actually produce the healing. And this is one of the things that goes wrong with a lot of these accountability processes is like the person who is harmed has this sort of unveiling of harm, this sort of like, almost like a ritualistic cultural sort of telling of sort of what has happened. It might be like a big Facebook post or a post on some other website or some other kind of large disclosure. And then people kind of come around them and say, like, we believe you. And you get a couple of people who are usually going to say they don't. And then sort of this whole process gets started. And somewhere along the line, they kind of can get this idea that like the noble thing to do will be to protect future people from harm. That's not that person's responsibility, first of all. And like them taking that onto themselves is likely to cause accountability abuse, basically, which is this whole thing where like you've weaponized this idea of accountability to endlessly keep this person who harmed you as this one caricature of a person, where if they actually change, if they actually figure out what they were doing wrong, if they were doing something wrong and like manage to adjust their behavior, that can then feel invalidating to that person who was harmed, because they're like, no, I need you to stay this like evil monster that I can just project all my pain onto. And if you change and get better, I mean, it's not going to make that person feel better, but punishing them is also not going to make them feel better. What's going to make them feel better is working on their healing and like having support and love and things that make them feel safe again. Thank you, Trooper. Let me see what else you said here. I'm actually curious. You said at Aradin, this is interesting. There is a move in a number of ace spaces to emphasize sex positive asexuality. Ace people who desire sex are ace people who will have sex with people regardless of their feelings about sex. The slogan here is action doesn't equal attraction. This is about a conflict of consent models. The current dominant sexual consent model is enthusiastic consent only. Oh, I have so many thoughts about enthusiastic consent. If it isn't an enthusiastic yes, backed with desire, it is a no. But a number of ace people say, but I will consent to set I don't actually want, or sex I don't actually want, in order to keep this relationship working, and that should be okay, but this is framed as coercive sex in our dominant consent model. And I agree with Rodden, you're saying, oh, asexuality is a broad spectrum. Personally, I would say I am sex repulsed asexual, meaning I am repulsed by the thought of having sex myself, but I don't have any problems with anyone else having sex or is bad or a problem. And then Rodden, you said at Trooper, that sounds like what Ariana was talking about, sacrificing some self-respect to maintain a relationship. As long as it is truly consensual, then that is their choice. Yeah, absolutely. Like there's many times, like it's very normal. Like if we have like a purely dominator model of reality, like if we tend to think of everything in terms of like game theory, like you win or you lose, and like, mutually assured destruction is like the way we think about the world, and like, this idea of there is a dominator and then there is an oppressed person. There's the master and the slave, everything. Then we're going to get these models of consent, and we're going to get these models of human interaction that lead to a lot of really just not great behavior, but also not great ways of processing your own life experiences. If you want to have that way of processing it, like go for it. Like I'm not here to tell you that there's one way to process reality. Like, I've mentioned on this stream many times, I've gone through lots of different ways of processing reality with mixed results each time. And if you think of the world in this way, it's going to produce a situation in which, especially when it comes to sex or any situation where there's a power dynamic, people love to talk about power dynamics. it's going to always be there is a dominator, a power, predatory experience that is being then put onto this other person, and that other person can never actually consent to what is happening to them. I think that that is only really, really useful if we talk about things like capitalism or just like our current economic models. Like, I cannot opt out of a lot of things. And I don't like us having market solutions for things that people can't actually opt out of. And the coercion that happens at this sort of like fundamental day-to-day level with our relationship to ourselves and like our time and our labor and like all this other stuff. That's maybe the only space where I really feel like it can be kind of a, I don't think it's a perfect explanation, and it's not necessarily the tool I even like to process it, but I will feel like, yeah, okay, we can talk about it there. But it's so much more complicated than that, right? Like, consent is not just about like things that I have a deep desire to do. One of my favorite examples is if I have a friend who like really loves Marvel movies and they like, they ship all these characters and they write fanfics. I mean, like, I love people who do that. You're cute. I love to watch people talk about it. Even if I'm like not actually listening to what you're saying, I'm just like, I'm just gonna vibe. I'm just gonna look at how cute you are. I don't like Marvel movies. I think that they're just like military propaganda. I don't think they have very much substance. I think they're just a bunch of attractive people quipping at each other and promoting the US military. But, whatever. A lot of people like them. My opinion is not the only one, and it's not the only valid one. If I have a friend who asks me if I want to go see the premiere of like some new movie and they're so excited because Loki, this, that, and the other, I might say yes, even though I hate those movies, because I want the experience of being there with this friend, and I want to be able to witness this pleasure that they're going to get, right? Like, it's the same reason why I love to watch videos on YouTube of like children trying things for the first time, because I'm just like, yes, I want to witness this like experience. I get a lot of joy and pleasure. I mean, it's why I've like, helped. Like, I go to all these festivals, these like sex positive festivals, to support people doing activities that I'm not actually going to do non-judgmentally, because I'm just like, okay, things are going to go wrong here. There's risk. I'm here to sort of bring, trauma-informed skills. I'm certified in psychological first aid. We're going to talk about these things. I'm going to help people work through some stuff if something goes wrong, and like hopefully do some harm reduction. But I also get a lot of pleasure of seeing people do their thing, even though I'm like, I have no interest in this like activity everyone's doing right now. But like, seeing people have a good time is nice, and I like to support that. And so I don't consent to doing that particular activity. I consent to being here for it, and that's also consensual. Just like I might consent to going to see the new Marvel movie with my friend because I'm so excited that after the movie is over, we're going to go get, ice cream, and they're going to just tell me all their theories, and I'm going to have enough context to know what they're talking about, and I get to enjoy how happy they are. This is like based on a true story. It's one of the reasons why I bring it up a lot. And that's still consensual, even though I hate those movies, and I basically am just like, when is it over? Because there's other things that I want there, and there's not only one model of desire. That's the other thing. So people have this very, very like singular model of what desire means, and desire has to be basically like full-bodied, enthusiastic, or it's just like, also, like, maybe is an important word here too. Like, I have said maybe to things people have asked me to do with them where I'm like, I don't actually know if I want to do this thing or not. Ask me again later. Or let's start and let's check in a little bit as we go along, and I'll see if I want to do it. And that's not non-consensual. That's me saying like, well, I don't know, let's try. Like, that's actually how I've lived a lot of my life. I often don't know if I'm gonna like something or not. I always say like I'll try anything twice, except things I hated the first time. Obviously, setting aside the things that I have ethical issues with or feel like are wrong to do. But for the most part, I'm kind of like, okay, I don't know, maybe I'll maybe I'll get into it. Like, there's this totally kinky thing you want to try with me, dude I used to date. Like, you're really into it. I'm pretty sure I'm not, but I'm down to try it at least once. And that is consensual. That is me genuinely consenting. And like we do the thing, and then I'm like, yeah, no, this is definitely not for me. And that doesn't mean that it's like not consensual, right? This is like the grayness of consent. Okay, there's some other things in the chat. Arada, you said you are going for the experience of that friend experiencing it, even if you don't care about the movie itself. 100%. Trooper. I think that is valid, though I also think it is valid to say I don't want to share the experience of the activity with someone who is doing it out of obligation or only in a service-oriented way. Yes, this is, I thank you for bringing this, because I do also mention that, which is like, my friend then also has the right to say, if you're only going to please me, we could find another movie to go to. Or like, how about we hook up after, like hang out after the movie is over or something. And that's also valid. Like, we can negotiate about this, but this is like, our autonomy is overlapping here. And that's where we have to negotiate. And you added, but this gets to what sort of consent? What is the flavor of consent? Yeah. I mean, again, our sort of model is that there's like not only one right way. I don't like the whole like one true way for most things. I think like even in things that seem like there is one true way, like heart surgery, there's actually like dozens of different techniques that are like considered really standard for a lot of things. And I think that a lot of the time it also denies people sort of lived experiences and like lived knowledge to say there's only one right way to do this, right? Like, nonverbal consent is completely valid type of consent. It is also riskier, generally speaking, unless you have very, very clear, very, very well and like stilled, like social and cultural norms around a specific activity that is communicated non-verbally. Then it's maybe not as risky, but it's still risky. And like, again, our model with Consent Academy is not like, here is how to do consent. We say, here are some aspects and some things you can practice and some like ways to think about consent that can help reduce risk of things going wrong. And then also, things are probably going to go wrong, and it's okay. And here's how to deal with it when things go wrong. Here, one of many ways to deal with it. And yeah, it erases nuance. For sure, it erases nuance. And Aradin, you added, I despise one true wayism, as it often boils down to my way is the right way. And if you aren't doing it my way, you are doing it wrong. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is such a huge thing. And it's a huge thing. It's one of the reasons why I love teaching about this stuff, because we always get an interesting mix of people, especially in our consent basics class. You'll get people who like feel very righteous and are very like, I know consent and I'm going to come here and I'm going to get words to talk about it and go with my rage. And a lot of time they don't like the class because we're just like, everything is gray and complicated, and like people can have completely different, even opposite experiences of the same situation. And that doesn't mean one person is bad or lying or invalid. And we still have to deal with things when they come up. Like, it doesn't, just because two people have opposite experiences of the same situation does not mean that they cancel each other out either. Because we're not going to come in and say, yes, let's start the crusade. Like, that's not how we do things. But we also come in and say, like, yes, and we can do better and we should try to do better. And like, we can hold each other to a higher standard while also being gentle and giving grace. And also, sometimes people come in and they're really scared because they think that we're going to like basically tell them that they're terrible rapists and that they're, should be excluded from all of society for all of eternity. And most of the time we're like, nah. Like, maybe there are some people who would meet the qualification of that word, but not most people. And it's very complicated. And yeah, sometimes we get shit for it. Like, genuinely, as an organization, every once in a while people really don't like us. They call us apologists, they call us deceptors. But most of the time, people really like our model, and people really like the nuance that we bring to these things. And it's also not possible for us to contain all nuance, right? Like most of my nuance I can get from like lived experience and thinking about this stuff a lot and sharing stories with people like we do here and like really diving into this stuff and trying to figure out what is going on, updating my worldview, updating my frameworks, uh, really trying to keep it as part of my identity that I am someone who changes their mind when presented with new information, because most of us don't. I know I don't even always do it, but like trying to make that part of my identity, I feel like increases the likelihood that I will update my opinion on things when presented with new evidence. Um, Also, one of the other things that can go wrong, especially in a lot of these sort of like social justice spaces or very like leftist or very liberal spaces, is something that we really try to avoid, which is this idea of guilt pride, which is like confessional sharing of how wrong and bad and guilty we are as a means to obtaining some other type of moral authority, where it's like, I know how badly these things can go wrong. Look at all of the mistakes I have made. Therefore, I have the moral authority to tell you how to live your life. You can see this in a lot of national, international policy things with like countries that are really big into like owning all of the atrocities they've committed in the past as a way to say, now I have the authority to tell all these other countries how to do what they're doing. And when you see that a lot with like people wanting to be very confessional around harm that they've caused, there can be ways of doing it that is very like, I want to share to give context, or I want people to feel that they can trust me or can relate to me, or like I want to show that I'm not perfect so that people don't. I like to do that sometimes with talking about consent, be like, let me talk about mistakes I've made with consent and ways I've really hurt people, as a way to make it so that there's not this idea that you have to be perfect in order to do better. um, and that in fact, like maybe the opposite is true. But it's also one of those things where I'm not doing it as a way of sort of like raising my profile as a person. I don't talk about like, here's how I've messed up at consent as a way to say like, and that's why I have all the moral authority to talk about it. And I'm like, no, I'm passionate. Here's my background. I'm not the only person who came up with this model. It was developed by a lot of people with like many different backgrounds and experiences and identities. And like, also, it's not the only way. And let's not be too scared to talk about it. Rodney added, I mean, just look at how terrible trans people are being treated right now in the US. It's beyond awful. Yeah, I mean, like for serious. Trooper, one trueism over ignores intersectionality. I was reading this book about caretaking, and it was mentioning if you are very keyed into what people around you are thinking and feeling and are highly developed in figuring out how to diffuse potential conflict, that is maladaptive and comes from having abusive parents. And I thought, or you Black in the US and have double consciousness, as Webb Du Bois wrote, and or W.E.B. Du Bois wrote, and we need to navigate the real dangers of interacting with white supremacy. Oh, absolutely. I mean, like, I think a lot of those people then justify the statement and say, well, that just means you're in an abusive relationship with American culture. And I'm like, okay, yeah, like that's kind of legit, but it also doesn't mean that it's maladaptive, because maladaptive has to mean that it was something that helped you at one point in time in your life, and now continuing to do that behavior is actually harmful. But if it continues to be helpful, it is not maladaptive. If it continues to produce the results that you're looking for, if it's protective, if it is not causing you extreme emotional harm and distress, if it's not like interfering with things, if it's actually still helping you, yeah. Arad, and you added, yeah, that might be one situation that can lead to that, but it is far from the only situation that can lead to it. And I would argue that it isn't necessarily maladaptive, although it could easily become that. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Yeah. All right. So it is 9:30 and I am getting a little bit tired. I mean, I was already tired, but I'm definitely feeling myself kind of fade. And I need to start unwinding before I get ready for bed. So I want to stop here for today. This has been really lovely. I really love having these kinds of conversations. I love when people share ideas. Even if you disagree with me, I love getting this information because, again, I don't have all the answers. I'm not right about everything. And it's nice. It's nice to chat with each other. It's nice to share these things. So I really appreciate everyone for being here today. If this is your first time here, consider giving us a follow. It's free and it's very nice. But you don't have to. Feel free to check out our other stuff. Tuesday, I'll be back with some more Stardew Valley, and we're going to talk about more to do with autonomy and death and dying and community consent, and we're going to have a lot of fun. I'm not in the Pacific Northwest. I live in Austria. I feel like I mentioned that, but I maybe forgot. I live in Austria, yes. And you can sehr gut Deutsch sprechen, but I'm learning a little bit. Anyway, someday, Trooper, we can chat to each other in German, and it would be lovely. I came back a while ago. Well, at one point, and then I've gone back. Been here 2 years now. And I love it. I like being here. It's very nice. Vienna is unbelievably easy place to live in. It's got a lot of problems, but it's like being wrapped in this like warm comforter 24/7. And it's maybe a little intense, like how like slow the pace of life is here. And then you can go to Berlin when you need something interesting. Yeah, time warp of COVID. Like my birthday's coming up and I'm like, there's no way I'm actually this old yet. Like, no. And I'm just like, right, COVID stole several years from us. Yeah, yeah. When I was back in the US a few weeks ago for a wedding, and I like took a bunch of pictures of like Americana stuff, and there were multiple pictures of just like used heroin needles on the ground to bring back to show my European friends who like have this very, fantastical view of the United States. And I'm just like, listen, here's all the quaint houses and the beautiful mountains and like the moose. And also there's all of this. So like, parking lots were a lot of subject of what America had. Anyway, thank you all for joining me. Check us out on social media if you want, and check out our upcoming classes on our website. And if you want more exclusive content, feel free to check us out on Patreon. Also gives you access to our Discord for just $3 a month. And every bit helps. All right. Thank you all so much, and I will talk to you on Tuesday. Bye.